pay my respect to Professor Bidyadhar Misra. And his work was micro-level work. Tremendous amount of work he did on village life, past and present, and better problem in Cuttack. In fact, there are studies on the better problem in Cuttack, tribal development projects, problem of small and marginal farmers, and Professor Vitali has already talked about his contribution to agricultural economics. So my own 2 words and to pay respects to Professor Bidyadhar Misra. What I intend to talk today, I don't want to talk very long, but there's an important issue which is a macro issue. I'm going to ask, there's a lot of talk that goes on about the debt. Indian debt today, in fact, per capita, if you see, all of us have a debt burden of somewhere about 1,30,000 rupees. We don't know. Each of us owe something like 1,30,000 rupees because, debt to GDP ratio is close to 90%. So I talked about, after a brief introduction, I talked about why we should worry about debt. Then I will talk about what happened during the pandemic and what are the economic consequences. And obviously, we have been worried about debt for a long period of time. Deficits and debt have been a major concern for all of us for a long period of time. So we said that we should follow a rule-based policy. We should ensure that there should be certain amount of control. When the markets fail, you want the government to come and control it. When the markets fail, you want a government intervention. What do you do when the governments fail? We need to ask that question. What do we do when the governments fail in their task? Why I am asking these questions is that we have come to accept everything that is told to us. Question everybody. Don't leave. Questioning is important. We need the set of institutions, set of policy and checks and balances to prevent the government failure. So that is rule-based fiscal policy is one of them. Basically asking the executive of the government to tell the parliament that this is what I have promised and this is what has actually happened. But invariably in most countries this rule-based fiscal policy has not worked. And the pandemic has actually worsened the situation. So that means that things are not done as well as they should. So we need the second generation reforms in terms of bringing about institutions. And the 15th Finance Commission has made a series of recommendations on how to really go about the budget management and budget reforms and to control debt through an institutional mechanism called the Fiscal Council. So I am going to be talking about these issues. Now, you might, they will look very difficult, distant, but they are very important for every one of us. Because because I am going to tell that what are the reasons why the excessive debt is very bad for us. The housewife, every housewife knows that she should not borrow more than what she can really afford. But the governments are not that clever as housewives. The problem is the governments think that they can go about doing things the way they want. So, deficits and debt have been a problem in India for a very long time. Now we had the crisis in 1991. During the second half of 90s, that is 85 onwards, when Rajiv Gandhi came to power, I mean, he was in a hurry. He wanted to do a lot of structure, a lot of this thing, and a huge amount of money was borrowed. Those days, when we said deficit financing, it's basically the government asking the Reserve Bank of India to give the money, which is creating money supply. So the things went on accumulating and accumulating, and the problem burst out when Saddam Hussein decided to invade Kuwait, and the prices of oil doubled, and these people had a major balance of payment crisis. And gold had to be lifted physically. In fact, Rangarajan has written a very recent book where he is talking about what he did as a deputy governor of the Reserve Bank. Physical gold had to be lifted to get money, and the money was not, the reserves were not sufficient to cover 3 weeks' imports. So we had that problem. Everything started with large deficits and accumulation of debt. And interestingly, you will see the Article 292 of the Constitution tells that the Parliament can impose limit on the government on the debt that it can borrow. There is a very clear indication in Article 292 that the Parliament can impose a limit. There was an estimate committee, there were several other committees which actually mentioned that, but then we didn't do it. And the government was borrowing, and the deficit was mounting. So, 1991 crisis was a changing point, this thing, but still things didn't happen better. Immediately the things got better, but by the time we came to 2000, the problem recurred. Again, you have a fiscal deficit of 10% of GDP in 2001. The government of India at that time decided to have a committee under the then Economic Affairs Secretary A.S. Sharma. It made certain preliminary recommendations, but actual recommendations came from the 12th Finance Commission, which was asked to look at the thing. And 12th Finance Commission made a recommendation that your deficit in a year, aggregate deficit of the center and the state should not exceed 6% of GDP. In fact, Govinda was asking me, why 3% at the center? You know, it must be massive treaty. In fact, interestingly, N.K. Singh once was talking about it, who became FRBM Review Committee Chairman in the 15th. In fact, at that time I told N.K. Singh that, Nandu, this is not that simple. Please go and read the 12th Finance Commission report. In an economy you have households, corporates, and the government. If you look at the savings investment balance, the corporates don't have a net saving. They have to make more investment. The government doesn't have a net saving because it borrows more money. It's only the households. And the households have financial savings and physical savings. If you save the money in a house or a gold, that is not available for borrowing. It's only the household sector financial saving that is important. And household sector's financial savings at that time was about 10% of GDP. The foreign money coming in, what is called the current account deficit, was about 1.5% of GDP. 1.5% of GDP was required for the public sector enterprises, and if you leave 4% of GDP for the private sector to borrow, ultimately money has to be there. If you leave 4% of GDP for the government sector commercial sector to borrow, then you are left with 6% of GDP, and that 6% of GDP, 3% for the center, 3% for the state. That's how the whole logic was created. There is a particular logic to that. A 3% Azad didn't come from manna, it's not a manna from heaven. So the rule-based fiscal policy started being followed. But 2008-9, they were to reach that, but then, there was political issue. I will not go into the details. The expansion of National Rural Employment Guarantee from 200 districts to the whole country. Pay Commission recommendation, farm loan waiver. These are the three things which were not actually put in the budget. So the 3% of GDP became almost 7.5% of GDP because in the meantime oil prices also increased. In fact, there was a meeting. I used to be a member of the Economic Advisory Council to the PM. Dr. Manmohan Singh called for a meeting, and then for some reason I was also called. And when I was asked to speak, I said, sir, these numbers given in the budget are wrong. Because I am not very diplomatic. So I said, these numbers are incorrect. Immediately my good friend Monte Carlo said, Govinda, you are a fiscal fundamentalist. So I told him that, look, I take it as a compliment. But then I am not saying whether the deficit more or less, I am saying that the numbers are not correct. We are still very good friends. So he said, now then Dr. Manmohan Singh asked me, what exactly do you think? Then I said, the number will be at least double that. Because these three policy decisions we have taken, we have not factored that in the budget numbers. And if you do that, it becomes double. As it turned out, the oil prices touched $165 a barrel in sometimes in July, and actually the comprehensive this thing for that year, fiscal deficit became 7.5% as compared to 2.5% that was actually budgeted. But anyway, that apart, these are some of the stories that happened. So obviously there is a problem we have had. We have been struggling. Every commission has been giving a target, and then we are not really adhering to the target. We have been taking pauses, we have been suspending things, we have been doing creative accounting, we have been changing the definitions. All sorts of things have been done. And this is not unique. Many other countries have also been doing this. And then of course we had the lockdown. And earlier, the total debt to GDP ratio was supposed to be about 60, the target was 60% of GDP. Now with the pandemic, everything went loose, and it became 90% of GDP. Now the question is, we need to get back. 90% of GDP debt is unsustainable. Now, if 25% of the revenues you generate, of course, you are paying interest rates. That means that money is available, your revenues only 75% is available for your spending for productive purposes. So, I am going to be talking about some things on the debt sustainability. There is some equation which I will avoid talking. I will only talk in terms of this thing. So I will also ask why we should worry about this deficit and debt. What are the various major consequences for that? And then what should we do to set the things right? Next.
Previous one.
As I said, is it the third listing or before that there was a question? You keep it there. I am not going to use the equation. But basically it says income in a country, when you calculate GDP, economic students will know, is equal to consumption plus investment plus government expenditure plus exports minus imports. It's a usual identity that we talk about in the macroeconomics. We also know that income is equal to consumption plus savings plus taxes. Taxes and non-tax revenue input. You see, put the second thing in the first one as substituting, and you will get a simplified equation. That means imports minus export, that means balance of payments. M minus S is balance of payments is equal to investment saving imbalance plus fiscal. Government expenditure minus taxes is basically a fiscal deficit. Now that means that if the fiscal deficit goes up, Either there should be a macroeconomic imbalance or there should be a balance of payment problem. These are all interdependent things. So, obviously, we can't afford to have more and more fiscal deficit for the same reason, because the Indian economy gets affected. I did talk about the 1991 crisis. Then there is something called so how do you really bring down the deficit? There is something called a Domer rule. You have heard of having Domer models, but Domer rule basically tells you that the debt will come down if you do not have a primary deficit. The primary deficit is that deficit that you incur during the course of the year, not taking into account the past interest payments. That means, fiscal deficit minus the interest payment, that is deficit during the year. And if that is zero, then so long as the growth rate of the economy is, nominal growth rate of the economy is higher than the growth rate of, than the effective rate of interest that you pay, debt will come down, because debt to GDP ratio we are talking. So basically, either you have to increase your growth rate of the economy, or you should reduce your primary deficit, or you should have a lower interest rate. Now the question is, in India, interest rate itself is suppressed. There is what you call the financial suppression. Governments borrow money at a rate much lower than the private sector borrow. This is because there is what is called the statutory liquidity ratio. The bonds have to be subscribed of 28% of the demanded time and liabilities of the banks, like for that, etc. Now that would have a different set of problems. But basically the overall debt to GDP ratio will come down if the Domer equation, that means if the growth rate of the economy is faster than the effective rate of interest that takes place. Now debt sustainability or reduction in the stability, sustainability would require us to bring down the primary deficit, and that's extremely important. Now there are 4 reasons why the debt is bad. One is, I mentioned to you, 25% of the revenue goes simply by paying interest payments. I am talking about central to states taken together. Number 2 is the one which I mentioned earlier, namely the financial sector savings is given. If the government takes more by way of borrowing more, less is left for the commercial sector. If less is left for the commercial sector, interest rate there will go up. If the interest rate goes up there, the economy is financially crowds out the private sector. That is real investment that has to take place, may not take place. And if your debt to GDP is, in other words, if the debt that the government borrows is not productively used, then obviously there is a problem. The third is debt means taxes to borrow. Somebody has to pay it back. On this, there is a very interesting discussion that has taken place in economics. Not very many people are aware of it. That means poor children today, they are not franchised, they have voted. You are borrowing and they have to pay back. There is something like intergenerational equity. So the burden of your borrowing today will go back to this thing. So if you do not really use the money that you borrow in a proper manner. There is a lot of interesting discussion that took place. Classical economists were very prudent. They said borrowing is bad. Borrowing particularly for consumption is bad. It has to be only for investment. There is something called a golden rule. That means current expenditure should not be, your borrowing should not be used for current expenditure. They said, so this is bad. But then came the Great Depression and then came Lord Keynes. For Lord Keynes, borrowing doesn't matter because ultimately if you demand that matter, the economy that matter, so obviously he went up. And the Keynesian view was beautifully described by Abba Lerner. So Abba Lerner went on to say that that opinion in the classical expression is a vulgar opinion. And then obviously everybody said, when the government floats bond, that is subscribed by people. It's an investment option. And when it is subscribed by people, they voluntarily do it. And when that matures, there is no problem again. The taxpayers will pay and then the bondholders will receive. There is only an exchange between the taxpayer and the bondholder. Where is the burden? Now, very convincing argument. In fact, there is a beautiful book by James Buchanan called Public Principles of Public Debt. In fact, this is available book, you can Google and get. He gives very neatly this argument. Then comes Buchanan. And there is some story about it, I will not go into. And Buchanan comes up and says, suddenly it occurred to him that everybody was following Keynes. Say that this is a new orthodoxy. You have vulgar opinion, then you have new orthodoxy. And new orthodoxy basically says, and he said, there is in economics something called an opportunity cost. That if that money that has been borrowed has been used in a better manner, it would have generated sufficient rates of income return, which would have been able, which would have serviced the debt and repaid the repayment. So there is something called an opportunity cost, and there were three propositions. He said private debt and public debt are not very different. The Keynesian said there is difference between private debt and the public debt. They are the same, both have to be paid for, and somebody has to pay. The second thing is that does involve that if the money is not used properly, then the taxpayer in the next generation will have to pay. There is a intergeneration equity issue, burden of debt will fall on the future generation. And the third one is that there is no difference between internal and external debt. Of course, when I wrote this up in my book, ready contract and said, I said, all these differences come that into us because external stability and debt, etc. Because we are not a fully convertible currency. If you have a fully convertible currency, your currency, exchange rate will take care of many of the other things. But then you can't afford to become fully convertible. So we have a peculiar problem in the context as far as the financial stability is concerned. But in principle, outside debt has to be also paid for, internal debt also has to be paid for. So what he said, after all, when you see the vulgar opinion and then new orthodoxy, and he said that it is ultimately the vulgar opinion that is the correct opinion. But anyway, these are some of the things that we see what happens when students come and we teach economics. We don't teach them some of the intricate, nice things. No, these are some of the things that have happened in the literature. So, next. So, when the pandemic came, we had a huge problem. There was lockdown and obviously the revenues fell down. And people's health and both lives and livelihoods had to be protected and huge amount of additional expenditures had to be done. Food security had to be extended to the whole country. And a lot of, much of the heavy lifting was done by the monetary policy, not the fiscal policy. But the fiscal policy also had about 1.5% additional expenditure to be made. So, now we got into a 90% this thing. Every country had this particular problem. You got into 90% of GDP, and partial recovery has happened in 2021-22. Now, I mean, if you look at 21-22, it's about the debt to GDP ratio is about 86%. And no, as I said, 85.6%. Next. I mean, this is a number, I don't want to get into. Every 10 years you have a problem, both the revenue deficit, fiscal deficit, and the debt stock. Revenue deficit is something which no household would like to have. That means you get the revenues and your housekeeping expenses. The difference between that is the revenue deficit. That means current revenues minus current expenditure is the revenue deficit. Fiscal deficit is the total revenues, including the disinvestment receipts. That means tax, non-tax revenues plus disinvestment receipts minus the total expenditures is the fiscal deficit. That is the amount of money that you are required to borrow every year, generally. And then on debt is the accumulation of fiscal deficit over a period of time. Next. Now, limited fiscal consolidation under rule-based fiscal policy. As I mentioned, the 12th Finance Commission gave the first one, and everything got rattled in 2008-9. Then came the 13th Finance Commission, which basically said that the central will generate a revenue surplus of 0.5% of GSDP, and there will be disinvestment proceeds of 1.5% of GDP and 3% of the revenue. So 3% of GDP they will borrow. That means 4.5% of GDP will be capital expenditure. So that's how it should be, and that didn't happen at the central level. At the state level, again Article 293 of the Constitution tells you that the states can borrow, but if they are indebted to the center, then they have to seek the permission of the center to borrow, which basically means the center will decide. States also do a lot of creative accounting. And possibly Odisha is one of those states which has been very prudent. But generally speaking, you go to sort of states like Punjab or Kerala for that matter, reckless borrowing that they do, they borrow through, there is a lot of opposite borrowing here. They borrow through public enterprises. Kerala has come up with created a company and floated a masala bond, and of course now it has gone to the enforcement directorate. And then floated it in the London Stock Exchange. and Punjab, if you really see the power sector deficit there, about 2 years ago I saw that because there was a committee under Monte Carlo requested B2B to looking at their finances. Not like 30,500 crores of subsidy on this thing, which is equivalent to 2.5% of the GSDP, is subsidy on the power sector. And the situation is not very different in Tamil Nadu. And then they don't want the subsidy, and then you have the Aam Aadmi Party coming and saying that no, we will not, and then it becomes a prestige. There is a newspaper advertisement basically saying that we have 0 bill and zero electricity bill for so 80% of the. I mean, is it our success? Is it a story of the success that we don't charge electricity? Somebody else has to pay. This has to come as free. But anyway, again, I don't want to get into the politics of it. Every political party, interestingly, you will be very surprised to know, long time ago, sometimes in the mid-70s, or maybe early 80s, there was a committee under Bhubaneswar, basically on the whole issue of this charging electricity. At that time he said, we should meterize electricity for the agricultural consumers and charge 50 paise per unit. There is an NDC committee, it's called an austerity committee. And not very many people. Now I do happen to have a copy of that report still with me. Even those days, those people used to think in terms of that. But we don't. We think that everything is free as if things are sent from heaven. So you have 14th Finance Commission, 13th Finance Commission thinks the targets remain where they are. In the 14th Finance Commission, we set that as far as again we set the targets. I happen to be a member of that commission. And but then we said for the states, if the debt to GSDP ratio is less than 25%, if the interest payment to revenue ratio is less than 10%, they can be allowed to borrow 25 basis points more. So 3% is the limit, but then the states which can afford, which have a better fiscal situation, can borrow more. We also talked about extended debt and deficit by saying that the power sector should be included in that, but in any case. So, but the point is that nothing would, they did, some of the states took advantage of that, not all of them. And very interestingly, Odisha always was much below what it was permitted to borrow. I have a very peculiar problem in my mind that's going on. And that is, it's generally about the poorer states. You have one size fits all target. That 3% of GSDP can borrow. Now 3% of GSDP for a very rich state which has a large absolute value of GSDP. And 3% of GSDP also for Bihar, which is the lowest per capita income state. The is enormous. But then they are not allowed to borrow. In other words, there is a sort of the entire scheme is biased in sort of against the poorer states in that sense. But anyway, that's a different point altogether. But the fact of the matter is, none of the Finance Commission's recommendations as far as fiscal responsibility and budget management was done. The things were suspended.